Yes, we are. Welcome, everyone. We are very happy to have today Mayra Pineda-Torres. She is an assistant professor in the School of Economics at Georgia Institute of Technology, and she recently finished her dissertation at the Department of Economics at Texas University last year in May 2022. And she works on health in the intersection of health economics, labor economics, and gender economics. She works on reproductive rights. I think Mayra is an applied economist, but she can tell us more about her work in a minute. And for Miriam Batkomsky, Marianne Johnson, and myself, this was very interesting to have Mayra in our webinar to have her perspective on reproductive rights from a more microeconomics point of view, but also more in general as an applied economist. So many of the people that are in the room are from the History of Economic Society or for the master degree at the University of Lyon too. So probably our question will be more on the perspective, on the impact, on the consequence, on some policies. But of course, we understand if you don't know any specific data or context, don't worry. This is a very larger project that we have with Marianne and with Miriam. And we are very happy that you accept our invitation. Kathleen Myers, that was here last week, she also quote your work. She talked about your articles and your research, and so she will try to connect today. But if not, well, I want you to know that we are many people interested in your work, and we are very happy that you are here today. So please, Mayra. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Rebecca. And I didn't know Kaylin was here before, so I hope I am not very repetitive in what I am going to say today. Please not the case. Hopefully I add more on what she already said, because as you probably learned last week, she's pretty much the expert as of today on studying economic access in the US. So hopefully I have something else to add beyond what she said. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, there it is. Okay, so once again, thank you so much for this invitation. My name is Mayra. I am an assistant professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And today I will briefly start my presentation talking about what we know about the economic impacts of abortion access from a microeconomics perspective, and particularly from a causal inference perspective. And then I will talk about one of my projects with Dr. Kelly Jones at American University, which tries or attempts to show evidence that abortion access still matters in the modern era from a health and education perspective. Okay, so I assume, well, I guess for most of the audience here, it's clear that abortion access is an economic issue. But sometimes we forget about this. Sometimes we think abortion is just a health issue. It just is a concern for other fields. It is not a concern for economics, but the reality is it should be a concern for us as economists, because just by the simple reason that we know this is a fact that an unwanted or early pregnancy can change someone's life. It can change the life of the woman or the person who is facing this situation, but also the children born after this. And in general, we have learned not only from economics, from other fields, that this can lead to inferior outcomes. That with inferior outcomes, I mean, these families or these women are more likely to live in poverty. These children are brought up in these families that are more likely to be poor. Educational attainment is affected. Labor market investments for women. In general, we have this evidence. But one way in which these unwanted or early pregnancies can be prevented is through access to reproductive health care, name it birth control, abortion, or other types of reproductive health care. And in particular, we have lots of evidence that access to abortion matters and it has causal impacts on women's health and economic outcomes. We have also lots of evidence in terms of birth controls, but today, since this is the area I have studied so far, I will focus on what we know about abortion access. So the way I see this literature is that we have two types of studies. In all these types of studies in terms of causal evidence of impacts of abortion access. So one big part of the literature has focused on the health impacts of abortion access, which could be changes in abortion access, abortion use, fertility, maternal health, etc. And we have two types of evidence within this literature, which are that evidence focusing on expansions of access, which can be anything related to a legalization of abortion, early access to abortion. We have evidence not only from the US, which is the setting I have explored in my research, but there is also evidence that comes from Spain, Norway, Mexico, Eastern European countries. There is a recent evidence also from Israel. But in general, all these studies agree on the fact that abortion access or legalization of abortion causes reductions in birth rates and improves maternal health. For the specific setting of the US, after abortion became nationwide legal in 1973, where the decision of the Supreme Court in the case Roe versus Wade, those states where abortion or opposition to abortion has been historically strong started implementing policies that could restrict abortion access from different perspectives. For example, parental involvement laws, which require minors to get consent or a notification from their parents, which is, in other words, a permit to get abortion services. There are also mandatory waiting periods, which require women to have two separate visits or two separate appointments to facilities. In the first one, they get some sort of consultation or counseling in which they get information about the abortions. And after that, in the second appointment is when they actually can get the procedure. There are also other restrictions, gestational limits, restrictions on private and public funding to abortion, etc. There is lots of evidence. Many people have explored this variation in access to abortion induced by these policies. And overall, they found that these policies reduce abortion rates. Some of them push abortions to later stages of pregnancy. And in some instances, this reflects in more births. So these policies, and as you can see from some of the studies I cite here, they are actually, some of them are relatively older. They are focusing on policies that happened a while ago. And also, we have also recent evidence, but in general, this evidence is coming from many, many decades ago. And this is something people have been exploring for many years. In terms of the economic impacts, the evidence is actually quite more limited. You can see the number of studies I'm citing here. These are 5 studies, excluding the one I am going to talk about today. So the evidence we have on economic impacts is very, very limited. Same story, we have evidence coming from expansions of access and also evidence coming from restrictions. In terms of expansions of access, this evidence is based on the US, Norway, and Spain. And these studies find that in general, expansions of access improve educational attainment. Particularly in the case of the US, this improvement was mainly focused on concentrated among Black teenagers. But overall, these 3 studies find improvements in employment, labor force participation, and wages. In terms of abortion restrictions, which are policies that are relatively more recent than the legalization here in the US, one study focusing on parental involvement laws finds that such policies reduce high school completion and college entry among Black women. And a more recent study focusing on the denial of an abortion due to gestational limits, which means, in other words, women that request an abortion, their gestational age was above the limit allowed in the state. So in this study, they compare different financial distress outcomes that could represent financial distress for women who were denied an abortion relative to women who were not denied the abortion. And in general, they found that these women who were denied the abortion are doing so much worse than the others. So what's the big thing here? Or where do we think there is more to say in the literature? The first thing that I already pointed out is some of the evidence we have is from many years ago. So we don't know if that evidence still holds, particularly in terms of the health outcomes. In terms of the economic outcomes, the evidence also is mainly focused on policies that were implemented many years ago, and things have changed for women. So what has changed? And these statistics I'm showing here are specifically for the US, but I believe we can find similar statistics for other developed countries, and even in some instances for developing countries. So things are different today in this decade or the past decade for women relative to what was in the 60s for them. So for example, in terms of educational attainment, in the specific case of the US, for example, now most women have a high school degree. And this was actually one of the big findings from the evidence exploring this variation in access coming from the abortion legalization in the 70s, that more women were getting a high school diploma. So therefore, it is not clear if abortion access now is changing today, people's ability to get a high school diploma, because most of them already have it. Then we see improvements also in terms of college completion or bachelor's degree, but we still see this gap. Not all women are getting a bachelor's degree. In terms of labor force participation, about half of the labor force in the US are women. Also, now it's not weird to find a household in which the breadwinner is a woman, so also labor force has changed for women. In terms of birth control, there are more options out there than in the 60s. Now, most women can access these services or get these products. But something to consider is not because there are more options out there, that means that everyone has the same access. Some of these options require you to have an insurance, and not everyone has insurance coverage, and therefore they don't have this access. So because of these things that are different, the big question is, or the question we really want to answer is, does abortion access affect women's outcomes in the modern era? And this is where I will start talking about this project I conducted with Kelly Jones. So we aim to answer this question by exploring the changes in abortion access driven by one specific type of policies, which are the target regulations of abortion providers, commonly known as trap laws. So these policies require abortion facilities to comply with very specific requirements in order to be allowed to provide abortion services. So these policies, which I will show you in the next slide, these are policies that are relatively more recent, more modern than the other policies, the other restrictions I described before. And by focusing on them, we're actually going to be able to answer three very specific questions. The first one is, does exposure to trap laws during adolescence affect women's educational attainment? In this study, as a preview from what I am going to show, we are going to focus on teenagers because we want to explore educational attainment. And we believe that if your exposure is early on in your life to this policy, to this restriction, your educational investments are more likely to change rather than if you are exposed when you are older and likely you have already made the decisions you were going to make regarding your education. We are also going to answer the question, what are the impacts of these policies on teenage fertility? Because we want to show evidence that there is a pathway, a fertility pathway that may explain these changes in educational investments. And then we're going to actually take one step back. This is kind of going from what happens at the end to what happens first. What is changing fertility? So what changes fertility? And if fertility is changing, then this is having downstream impacts on education. This is pretty much what we want to show here. What trap laws and why we're not focusing on the other policies. Because trap laws are very reflective of what the modern abortion landscape is in the US. Thinking about this landscape before June 2022, before the Dobbs decision when Roe versus Wade was overturned. So trap laws were the fastest growing abortion policy in the US in the last few years. As you can see here, we are comparing with parental involvement laws and mandatory waiting periods, which are two of the most common abortion policies in the US that states have. And if we actually take this graph from here up to 2021, in 2021, actually the number of states that had those policies increased by quite more. So actually, I believe it was actually above parental involvement laws by 2021. And this is, I will speak about this at the very end of the presentation, but the way I see these policies is as if they provided us or can provide us a preview of what we can expect in terms of abortion access in the US now that the Dobbs decision has been made and abortion is not nationwide legal anymore, because these policies closed clinics and abortion bans close clinics. So they don't close clinics at the same extent, but they have similar impacts in the sense that they restrict access to abortion for everyone that wants to access an abortion facility. So that's why we're focusing on them. So in this study, we're going to provide evidence that abortion access affects women's economic outcomes in the modern era. So even though I showed you and I told you before that things have changed for women, for some women still access to abortion matters a lot today. We are presenting the first evidence on the causal impacts of education, of these supply side restrictions on education. We expand the evidence on the impacts of trap laws on abortion access, abortion use, and teenage fertility, because we have some evidence from previous studies from two specific states, Texas and Pennsylvania. And for this study, we actually had to do a lot of data collection in the sense that we didn't know for sure what states had trap laws. We didn't know what different types of trap laws a state could have. And the most important thing we didn't know was when these trap laws were implemented. So we actually had to create a data set in which we pretty much coded those states that had trap laws, what type of trap laws they had, when they were implemented, if they were eventually overturned, so that we could have this source of variation, right? We could pretty much create this treatment group we wanted to explore. So before I start talking about everything we did, let me tell you very briefly what's the mechanism we have here in mind of how a trap law or an abortion policy could affect an economic outcome of a woman. So the idea here is that we have an abortion policy. In this case, we have trap laws. And this abortion policy can affect women's economic outcomes, for example, an outcome such as educational investments through two pathways. The first pathway, the obvious one, is, well, if I am facing an abortion restriction such as a trap law, which is closing clinics, and I am currently pregnant, but I don't want to be pregnant, I may be unable to interrupt this unwanted pregnancy and be forced to carry to term this pregnancy. When this situation happens, particularly for women who are very young, for women who are in the school or are still making these investments in education, this may represent pausing their education or completely abandoning their education. But there is this other pathway that was discussed a lot in the context of the oral contraception. In this paper from Lawrence Katz and Claudia Golding, they actually discuss this pathway a lot. And the papers that came after also, some of them talk about it, which is you don't need to be pregnant to be affected by a policy, a reproductive healthcare policy. Because even if you are not pregnant, for example, a trap law can create uncertainty about your ability to control your future fertility. And this may change your expectations and aspirations for the future, ultimately affecting your educational investments. So what are we able to show you, or from this figure here, what am I able to show you with the things we estimate? Okay. The first thing is we estimate the effect of trap law implementation on early births, thinking about the unwanted early births of teenagers. We estimate the reduced form effect of trap law implementation on educational investments. And since this is the reduced form effect, I won't be able to tell you if this is completely driven by the direct effects pathway or the indirect effects pathway. I am only able to tell you that there is an effect of trap law implementation on educational investments, likely induced by the direct effects pathway, because before that, I will show you this evidence that there is an effect of trap laws on early births, but that doesn't rule out the possibility that also the indirect effects is playing some role in changing educational investments. And at the very end, I will take one step back and I will talk about very briefly about what may be inducing these changes in fertility, which are changes in abortion access, abortion use, and teenagers' sexual behaviors. Okay. So now what we do in this study. So the first thing we do is code these trap laws, identify what is a trap law. So a trap law, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is a policy that restricts or requires abortion facilities to comply with certain requirements in order to be allowed to provide abortion services. We identify 4 main types of trap laws, which are admitting privileges, which require physicians providing abortions to have admitting privileges in a hospital to admit and treat patients there in case of emergency. The transfer agreement requirements are agreements within clinics and hospitals to transfer patients in case of emergency. Building regulations target the physical structure and the characteristics of the clinics, for example, the types of rooms, room sizes, ventilation, etc. And distance regulations, which are a more recent type of trap laws, often implemented in combination with admitting privileges, require clinics to be located within a certain distance or travel time from a hospital. So what do we know so far about the causal impacts of this policy? The evidence comes from studies focusing on policies implemented in 2 states, Texas and Pennsylvania. In both states, after the implementation of trap laws there, the facilities couldn't comply. More than half of the facilities couldn't comply with the policies, and they ended up closing. In the case of Texas, what happened is that this changed the distance women had to travel to the nearest provider, causing this change in distance, this increasing distance caused reductions in abortion rates. There is some evidence of increases in birth rates, and more recent evidence also points out to increases in violence against women because of this policy. In Pennsylvania, the distance women had to travel to the facilities didn't actually change because most of these clinics that closed were located in Philadelphia, and some other clinics that remained open were also in Philadelphia. But what this policy created was an excess demand for the services of the open clinics, which ultimately reflected in reductions in first trimester abortion rates. Some women had to push their abortions to later stages of pregnancy, and this reflected in some cases in increases in birth rates. So with our data collection effort, we identify the states highlighted here or colored here as ever implementing a trap law from any of those 4 types I described before. And there are 2 main takeaways from this map. The first one is that the implementation of trap laws is obviously non-random, right? Some states are more likely than others to implement trap laws, and we can see that these policies are more persistent in the south of the US and the Midwest. And the second takeaway I want to make here that is important for what we're doing here is that trap laws became more common after 1992. And this is not just because. This happened because in 1992, the Supreme Court made a decision in the case Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And long story short, that changed the standard that states had to follow to implement policies that could restrict abortion access, and it became relatively easier for them. Such as we see here that trap laws became more common after 1992, and actually more common years after. Even they were not so frequent in the 90s, such as in later years. But such as we observe this map here, if I were going to make a map for parental involvement laws or other policies, you would see a similar pattern, that those policies became more common after 1992. And the reason why I am mentioning this is because these are the policies we are going to focus on in our analysis. Everything that happened between 1992, we are not using it to induce a variation in access. Okay. So for our study, we rely on many different data sources. The first one is this trap law legal coding that we constructed, and we focus on the policies in this period. And this has to do in terms of the analysis we are performing for births. First of all, we have event studies, so we need enough periods before and after the policy to have the same number of periods for each one of the policies. I hope I was clear with that, but we should have the same number of periods for each policy before and after to have this balanced panel. Then we use for the fertility analysis births recorded in the US. For the educational attainment analysis, we use the microdata from the American Community Survey. Then to explore these mechanisms that may be explaining these changes in fertility, we use information at the county level on the distance and travel time to the nearest abortion clinic. We use information on abortion use and abortion counts from the CDC abortion surveillance system and Guttmacher Institute that are the main two sources of information on abortions in the US at the state level. This is often when you see a paper about abortion, they will show evidence or they will use the information from both sources because none of them is perfect. Both of them have some issues. So it's better to see what's going on with both of them. Because the counts, there is a big correlation between the counts, but still they are not exactly the same. And then in terms of exploring changes in teenage sexual behaviors, we use the information from the CDC Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, focusing on two outcomes: the probability of having initiated a sexual life and the probability of having used contraception in the last intercourse. And finally, there may be some concern that the implementation of other policies may be correlated with the onset of trap laws. So in our analysis, we control for the implementation of other abortion, contraception, and welfare policies that I am listing here. So these are our time paradigm controls. Okay, so the first analysis establishing the existence of this fertility pathway. So for this analysis, our main empirical approach is an event study. This is a Poisson regression because our outcome is a count. These are number of births. And these are number of births of women who were 15 to 19 years old at the time of the delivery. We have these time varying controls here in this X. We have our different treatment indicators, which are for each period before and after trap law implementation for treated states, fixed effects. And in this case, we define the outcome as the count. This is not a rate, but since we are controlling for the population and constraining its coefficient to be equal to 1, this is algebraically equivalent to having the rate, but this is a better approach when you have counts. And now I am going to show you the event studies for 4 different samples of women. So the first one are all the teenagers in our sample. All the teenagers that were exposed to trap laws, all the teenagers that could have been exposed to trap laws or not, depending on their state of residence at delivery. And the first thing to observe here is that for the group of all teenagers, we are not confident there is a causal effect of trap law implementation on their births because we have one period here in the pre-intervention period, a few years, in which we don't have evidence of parallel trends. However, as you may remember, when I described the literature, the previous literature, I pointed out that some studies, and actually often studies for the US, find differences in impacts of abortion policies or contraception policies. These impacts are different across demographic groups. So thinking of this, we separated our sample in subsamples of women according to their race and ethnicity. So we separated Hispanics from non-Hispanics, and among the non-Hispanics, we separated them between white and black. And as you can see, for non-white Hispanic teenagers and non-Hispanic white teenagers and non-Hispanic black teenagers, we have this evidence of parallel trends between births of teenagers between trapped versus non-trapped states. And very interestingly, as you can observe here, the average effect for both groups after trap law implementation in terms of changes in births are increases of about 3.2 to 3.5%. So actually the effects are not so different between these two groups. In terms of Hispanics, we don't find any evidence of a change because it's very clear that we have this very weird trend before, so we cannot say anything about Hispanics. But I think this is an interesting finding that in terms of fertility, white teenagers and black teenagers responded very similarly, or births of white versus black teenagers responded very similarly. So something else, let me think if there is something else I want to, how much more time I have? Because otherwise I don't want to use more time on this.
You can have 10 or 15
Okay.
minutes more, and then we can have the questions.
Okay, so a few things I wanted to mention about these figures. You may be wondering what's going on here, that the trend for each one of these groups continue growing, and there is this lag effect here. So we have some hypotheses. Some of them we were able to test them. Some others is a pure speculation of our end based on some facts that we couldn't test. So the first one is that there maybe, we thought maybe this increasing trend has to do with the fact that these women, these states that implement trap laws, they don't often implement one trap law. They actually implement one or several at the same time, and then they implement more and more. So maybe we are capturing this cumulative effect of trap laws. So actually we did some tests in which we define treatment as the number of trap laws across time. And this increasing trend persists. Actually, it doesn't change. So it's not that. So what else can be explaining this? One thing is that some states provided the clinics with grace periods in which they would have certain number of months or a year to comply with the law. And if after that they couldn't comply with the law, they had to shut down. So in many instances, clinics ended up shutting down because, for example, in terms of a distance regulation, even if they had the grace period, a hospital wouldn't open within 1 year in front of them, right, to comply with the law. Some clinics, complying with the laws is not constant, right? You may be able to comply this year with the law, but maybe next year you are not able as a clinic to renovate this transfer agreement with a hospital, or you as a physician to get the admitting privileges. So we think this is kind of the cumulative effect of different things going on. Clinics also face congestion across time if more clinics close. So we think that what we're capturing here is that actually there are cumulative effects that are happening across time, particularly because clinics end up not being able to comply with the laws at some point in time. Okay, so now I will move on to the reduced form estimates on educational attainment. And by the way, I wanted to mention, just in the interest of time, I won't show it, but we tested the robustness of these estimates to an alternative approach because, as you may be aware, there are these recent developments in terms of using two-way fixed effects and the potential bias it can induce in the estimators. So we tested the robustness of these estimates to an alternative approach, which is stack diff in diff, and they are very robust. So in terms of educational attainment, we use, once again, a diff in diff. In this case, this is a pool diff in diff. This is not event study because we don't have a panel. These are repeated cross sections. And here we exploit variation across states and over time on the implementation of trap laws. Here, because of the nature of the data we're using, we define treatment in a different way. So here, a woman in our sample is considered as treated if she was exposed to a trap law before age 18, and this is ideally defined by the state where they were living when they were teenagers and the year in which they were born. And I will explain in a minute why I said ideally. Here we explored three outcomes, but I will only show you evidence of two of them, which was high school completion, college initiation, and college completion. The reason why I won't show you anything about high school completion is because we didn't find anything for that outcome, which we pretty much expected. I will show you estimates for the group of non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic blacks, because these are the groups in which we could establish the existence of a fertility pathway. We also control for the exposure during adolescence to each one of those other abortion, contraception, and welfare policies I showed before. And we include state fixed effect, age fixed effect, and year of birth fixed effect, age at interview fixed effect, and state fixed effect. So as I mentioned before, ideally we want to know in what state a woman lived when she was a teenager, so that we can say with full confidence this woman was exposed to trap laws because she was living in this state when she was a teenager. Unfortunately, the American Community Survey doesn't have that information. The only geographic information we have on people that were interviewed is the state where they live when they were interviewed and the state where they were born. So we are going to use here as a proxy of the state where they live when they were teenagers, the state where they were born. It's not perfect. However, 75% of migration in the US happens intrastate. So we believe we may be capturing here some women, or 75% of the women that didn't move to another state. So this table shows the outcomes. The first two columns are for the group of non-Hispanic white women. The next two columns are for the group of non-Hispanic Black women, and we have two outcomes for each one of them. I am presenting evidence for two samples of women. The first one is the full sample of women that meets some criteria that I won't describe for the interest of time in our analysis, but the sample of women that we keep from the American Community Survey who were exposed or not exposed before age 18 to trap laws. And then to deal with this potential issue with migration that we are not able to fix because of the geographic information we have, we alternatively estimate our model, our regression, for this subsample of women that live in the same state at the time of the interview in which they were born, assuming these women never migrate to other states while they were teenagers. So the first thing to notice here is that for the group of non-Hispanic white women, we are actually finding very little to no evidence of impacts of exposure during adolescence to trap laws. On college initiation, there is no evidence there, and some evidence of a 0.7 percentage point decrease in the probability of completing college. However, when we focus on the second sample we have, which are those women that didn't move or live in the same state where they were born, we don't find this evidence anymore. However, once we focus on the sample of non-Hispanic Black women, we have this very consistent evidence that trap laws have these downstream impacts on education. The impacts are not just concentrated in fertility. We observe that when Black women are exposed to trap laws during adolescence, their probability of initiating college decreases by about 1.2 to 1.5 percentage points. In percent relative to the mean, this one in particular, this is about a 2% decrease. In the case of college completion, we also find this evidence, this very consistent evidence of exposure to trap laws during adolescence, decreasing the probability of completing college by about 1.4 to 1.5 percentage points, which is about a 6% decrease. So what does this mean? It seems that even though there are these big effects on education, on fertility for the two groups, ultimately, these effects persist only for one of the groups, which are the group of non-Hispanic Black women. So now let me very briefly tell you about how these results compare to what other people have found before. Because remember, the big question was here, does abortion access still matters today? And I guess the next natural question is, but how much it matters relative to how much it mattered in the past? So there are 3 studies, including our study, that focus on educational attainment. We have the first one. This is a study from 2000, which explored this variation in access that was induced by some states legalizing abortion before 1973, when it became nationwide legal. So they use this variation. They use information from the census. These are the cohorts of women they are including in their analysis, and they focus on 3 outcomes. And they find that, as expected, legalization of abortion improves high school graduation, college completion, college initiation, and college completion. Then we have Borelli's study. This is a 2011 study that focuses on variation in abortion access induced by parental involvement law. So this is already a restriction. She focuses on cohorts that are a little bit younger than these cohorts. Same story, defines the exposure is also during adolescence. And she finds specifically that parental involvement laws reduce high school graduation by about 2.3% and college completion by about 7%. So this effect, if we were going to take the opposite of this is actually not so far away if we're going to mirror these results, even though some time has passed between these cohorts and these cohorts here. And then we have our study in which we're using the same data source as Borelli. We're focusing on, we are focusing on there is some overlap within our cohorts, but we are also including women that are younger. And we find no effects for high school graduation, effects very similar if we take the opposite sign to what Angris and Evans found in terms of college initiation. And very interestingly, in my opinion, our effects for college completion are very close to what Borelli found. So time has passed, but effects or how impactful abortion access is hasn't changed that much, which I think it's very interesting. And I think it's more than interesting, it's concerning that how come for some people abortion access keeps mattering that much if in theory things have changed for women in the US. So to conclude very briefly, I mentioned before what could be driving these effects, these changes in fertility. So we explored changes in abortion access by using information at the county level on the distance to the nearest abortion facility. And we find some suggestive evidence that after trap law implementation in those counties located in states that implemented the laws, average distance to the nearest abortion provider increased by about 10 to 11%. Then we check if this translated in actual changes in abortion use. And we observed that in those states that implemented trap laws relative to states that didn't implement trap laws, teenage abortion rates decreased by about 5%. And then we explore potential changes in teenage sexual behaviors, thinking that, well, maybe teenagers, they are not having babies if that's the case, because maybe they are having sex less frequently, or they are not having sex, or they are more prone to use contraception because of these policies. But we actually find some very suggestive evidence, not that convincing, that white girls are more likely to delay their sexual debut by about 5%. We don't find any evidence among Black girls, and we don't find any evidence of changes in contraception use among any of our two groups. So to conclude, we find that abortion access still matters today and affects women's ability to control their fertility and alters their educational investments. We find this by exploring changes in abortion access induced by trap laws. And these trap laws affect births, particularly for non-Hispanic teenagers. These effects are mainly driven by reductions in abortion access and abortion use. And the downstream impacts are particularly concentrated among Black women exposed to trap laws during adolescence, who are less likely to initiate college or complete it. And just to conclude, because as I said, this is before DOPS. So what does this represent now that the DOPS decision has been made and abortion access in the US is not nationwide anymore? So we don't know yet because we don't have the data, but I think these results speak for, if you see this map, actually it's very similar to the map I showed you before on what states had trap laws. We can actually overlap them. So what does it mean? That probably our findings are a lower bound of what we can expect now for the next few years for those states in which abortion has been banned. We have these statistics as of the last few months in which 12 states, these maroon states here, which are states that actually had trap laws, don't allow abortion anymore. There are 12 other states that are hostile in the sense that either they are going to ban abortion as well, or they are going to implement policies that will make abortion access completely illegal, or well, virtually illegal. There would be abortion access still allowed, but very difficult to access it. And as of today, this represents about 15 million women in the US who live farther away for at least 2 hours from a provider. And then there are these extreme cases such as Texas and Louisiana, in which women have to travel at least 7 hours to reach a provider. So the point here is that this is in some way a preview to what we can expect for the next few years if we really stay in this situation in which abortion is banned in some states. So thank you so much. And once again, thank you for the invitation. And please let me know if you have questions.
Thank you very much, Mayra, for this presentation. Who wants to start with questions or comments? Can you please stop sharing your screen? Then we can see each other. Yes. Who would like to start? I have some questions, but I don't want to start. Somebody wants to. You can write your questions on the chat, or you can. Okay, Marianne, please.
I'm really interested in the finding of the racial disparity, because we've seen that in a couple of other presentations. And I'm wondering, has anyone, or are you able to kind of break this down into the amount of difference is due to maybe educational attainment, or is attributable to lower income levels, or is it really something that's more structural, like social capital? And because we also saw this earlier for the very low income classes and the lower educated classes in like the end of the 19th century, right? And in that case, it was both predominantly education and income. And I'm wondering what the explanation might be for the United States now.
So we actually attempt to do something like that. So I have it here in the presentation. Let me, if you allow me, I will share my screen again, but I didn't want to show it like as main result because I didn't know if I would have time. So our main concern here is this finding talking about race by itself, or this is about income, because there is this big correlation between income and race, particularly lower income is very highly correlated with being black in the US. So we couldn't do a lot about it. So we just used the information we had on women when they were young, which is the state where they were born. So the idea here is that we constructed measures of race-specific poverty at birth at the state level. And then we classified states as a highly race-specific poverty versus low race-specific poverty for each one of our groups. So the idea here is we should only observe effects concentrated among the high poverty states if this is just about income. So we do find that, we actually find these are the two samples, and we find that the effects are stronger and mainly statistically significant whenever we're talking about a higher race-specific poverty at birth. However, even though this is not statistically significant here, you can see that still the magnitude of this coefficient relative to the coefficient we observe for the same outcome for white women is twice as large. So our reading from this situation is that economic disadvantage at birth, yes, is a very strong predictor of how much job loss are going to affect you in the future, but we cannot rule out that there is still something structural here that may be explaining these differences in impacts.
Somebody wants to continue?
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm sorry again for not having my camera on. So when you present, I'm not familiar enough, and I have any familiarity with these tableaus. So when you present them, they saw to me as reasonable to guarantee safety in abortion. But then during the presentation, I realized that they were designed to restrict abortion for women or access to abortion for women. So how we can, it's more a policy question, how we can make compatible this protection or the conditions for safe abortion with laws that are not aiming to restrict access to abortion for women.
So I will give you my answer from what we read a lot that the medical community has to say, because ultimately I can tell you these policies are not safe, but I am not a doctor, right? So I cannot tell you with full certainty. However, the medical community has been opposed to these policies because these policies, abortion, first of all, to begin with, for a facility to provide abortions, they have to get a license. They have to comply with many different things just to be open. So therefore, by the point in time in which a facility opens, it already passed all those filters. So why the medical community opposed these laws is because they claim they are unnecessary they just made access to abortion very restrictive, difficult to access, and ultimately they don't make abortion safer because abortion provided in a legal setting is already very safe. Actually, abortion is safer in terms of a probability of mortality of the women relative to birth, for example. So in terms of those providing abortion, this is not adding anything in terms of safety. It is just making everything harder to be provided and to be accessed. Does that respond your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So it, in a way, is redundant. It's
exactly.
not, because it's redundant, that is not effective, and it's acting as something that make more difficult the access to abortion.
So, for example, you may remember I had this third category that were the building regulations. So within that category, we included one type of laws that are the ambulatory surgical center requirement. So ambulatory centers are actually like small facilities in which they provide surgeries, like some not super invasive procedures, but they are way more like riskier than an abortion. So some abortion facilities are subject to that same standard, even though some abortions even don't provide surgical abortion. They are just providing medication abortion. So there is not even a surgery involved, but they have to comply with the same requirements as other health facilities providing actually surgeries that are way more invasive or more dangerous than an abortion.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. Can I make another question?
Sure.
I'm curious about how you think you can continue this research, which kind of data you can study to make, how do you have any ideas of how you can continue this type of studies?
You mean like this same study exploring other outcomes or other studies, like what in specific?
Both.
So
both.
We were like very ambitious with this project. Like we started like really wanting to see changes in everything. So, but ultimately we were able to say with confidence, like there is this causal evidence that is very robust and consistent about across our different estimates was educational attainment. We think it may have to do because, as you saw, we had to limit our analysis up to 2013, because by the point in time in which we were working on this, which was like when we started 3 years ago, there was data, like the data on births was for 2019 was not yet out. So if we wanted to explore other outcomes or go a little bit beyond, I think we would have to include more years of data in our data set, to include more policies, more recent policies. Other things, I don't know if I would like to continue exploring these trap laws. I think now I would say, I would like to explore something more general, like impacts of abortion policies, not just trap laws, but these require pretty much coding all the other policies, right? Kaylin Myers, she has already coded some of them, but there are some other policies that haven't been coded. So I think what I would like to pursue next is to have a more like general overview that what abortion access is in the US based on all the different restrictions that women face. So I know that's not exactly what you answered, but I think that's what I would be doing now.
Thank you very much. I was also curious about your future ideas for research, because I was wondering how much these kind of studies could be compatible with more qualitative studies, with interviews and other types of evidence beyond data, the data that you are using.
I mean, you know, as economists, we often don't do these kind of things, but at least I don't do it. But that doesn't mean that people shouldn't do it. Actually, people in other fields, you find a lot of evidence about what abortion access is in other fields. Demographers have lots of evidence about it, sociologists, even in public health. And I think there is a lot to learn from that. For example, I had another project, which is about these mandatory waiting periods for abortion. There are several studies in economics about the causal impacts of these policies, but there are many qualitative studies that literally went to the facilities, interviewed the women and asked them, like, what do you think about this policy? So even though I am not doing this, I don't think I have the training to actually do a very good survey. I think there is a lot to learn from that, because that gives you a better perspective of if these ideas you have in mind or these mechanisms you have in mind actually exist. So in this case, these ideas we had, like, for example, the mandatory waiting period just makes everything more expensive because now women have to travel 2 times to the facility. It was true. Women, like, the main complaint was, now I have to, instead of having to, like, arrange all these logistics to go to the clinic once and get all the money for that, now I have to do it twice. So that kind of confirmed what we were believing. So I think that was very helpful for us.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the presentation. I learned a lot.
No problem. Thank you.
Any other question?
So I see you have
Yes,
some.
I put some
Yes.
question in the chat. So for example, I'm very curious on how you code, how you do the coding of the trap laws. So
Oh,
how
yes.
you can resume, how you can sit, is very
It was very hard. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, it was good now that it's done, but it was a lot of work. I mean, Melanie is in his call, and I think she's done it before for contraception policy, the oral contraception. But we started, actually, the way we started this project was with information that was collected by 2 researchers in Canada. So they had this paper with this very nice table in which the policies were there. So it was perfect because information was there. But once I started presenting this project, people would ask me questions, people that knew about this policy, like, but what about this policy in this state? So then I figured, like, okay, we have to actually go from the basics and try to see what an actual trap law is, because we didn't, like, really know the extent of what a trap law was. So you mentioned there what different types of trap laws are. There are actually many. And from those 4 types I mentioned in my slides, there are actually many subtypes depending on what they are targeting. So for example, some of them target the first trimester abortions. Some others target all abortions. Some other only second trimester abortions. So actually we made decisions on what to include and what not to include in our coding. And the idea was to have the most comprehensive set of policies or subset of policies that had the potential to close facilities and to prevent most women looking for an abortion, to get an abortion. Because, for example, those policies only targeting second trimester abortions are less impactful than policies targeting all abortions, for example. So we literally have a data set in which we coded, like, what was a those targeting first trimester abortions, those targeting all abortions. In the case of building regulations, what physical things of the facility were included? Is it the room size? Is it the type of room? Is it the ventilation? So we created all these, like, we have everything documented, but in the end, we tried to just keep that was the most impactful the most, and that was also clearly implemented, because some other policies also we didn't know, like, was this implemented or not? Because we would find some news articles saying, like, this abortion facility is suing the Department of Health in this state, so therefore it was not really clear if the policy was immediately implemented or ever implemented.
Okay. And then probably what interested me more was a comment that you say at the beginning about how these laws, or even now, you know, the very last legislation, affect the behavior of the teenage, their sexuality, their relation with their body, I mean, yeah.
So I would say, like, I don't know. And I don't know because we don't have very good data to test this, but I feel like the first thing in order to establish, like, that teenagers are reacting to these policies is being able to say they are actually perceiving these policies. They are aware of the policies. So that was actually something we tried to accomplish, or we really wanted to see with the information on teenage sexual behaviors. Because if they were actually changing their sexual behaviors, that in some way imply, okay, they are perceiving the policies. But first of all, this data, the YRPSS, is subject to voluntary reporting from the states. So we have some missing data, and even if they report the data, they may omit some of the variables. And usually the variables information omitted is usually information on sexual behaviors. Because of this, I mentioned the word suggestive, because we are not fully certain we actually are able to capture something. But my guess is I am actually not fully sure. Maybe as of today, teenagers are aware about what abortion access is in the US because of the news, because of this huge change in policy. But my prior is that actually teenagers become aware of policies once they need the abortion. And usually people become aware of what abortion restrictions are in place in their state once they need the abortion. So my guess is that this may change their behaviors if they actually need the abortion. But I don't know. This is full speculation from my end.
And, you know, very last comment. So do you think that now, after the decision of the court, maybe the fees of the universities that are located in the states that abortion is allowed will be increased? It's like,
I don't know, but I've heard, I think it was in another presentation I had, someone, I don't know, my answer to this is I don't know, but something I never mentioned here before and I didn't think about was that some people were concerned that universities located in highly restrictive states, the enrollment would decrease or would be lower relative to universities located in states that are more permissive of abortion, because teenagers don't want to be subject to needing an abortion, or well, young women subject to needing an abortion and not being able to get it. However, I think this goes back to what I mentioned before, which is right now teenagers are more aware, but I feel like the college decision involves many other things. And I think the financial part is a way more bigger component than an abortion facilities in the state where I am. People here in the US often go to universities in their state of residence, right? Because the tuition is lower. So I could see how people may think about it, but if they have the privilege to think about it, if they have just one option to go to college, I think they are just going to take that option. But that's, again, a speculation from my end.
any other question or comment? No? Okay, if not, I think we can thank you very much, Mayra.
Thank you for the invitation.
And please, we keep in touch because, you know, with Marianne Johnson and Mia Markovsky,